Hello, and thank you for joining us in our webinar today on managing complex projects in Microsoft 365. From an agenda perspective, we're going to start off with some introductions and then go into a client overview as well as talk about some client challenges. From there, we're going to move into talking about a migration path of moving from on-premises into Microsoft 365. We'll also talk about a day in the life of a construction PM and what that looks like or could look like in modern workplace with 365. Then we'll dive into the importance of templating and provisioning project sites, go into some external sharing, and then wrap up with a summary QA and closing from there. So what I'll do now is I'll hand it to Peter to introduce himself. Thank you.
Thanks, Logan. Peter Carson here. I'm going to be co-presenting with Michael, who's going to introduce himself in a second here. President of Extranet User Manager, as well as an Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact details are here in the presentation. We are going to be uploading a copy of the deck as well as a recording, so you can get all the details after the fact. Michael, if you want to just advance to the next, quick intro on Extranet User Manager for those of you that are not familiar with the organization. We started out with a single product that sort of evolved from what we did for custom solutions for our clients, and over the years turned into a bespoke product, and that's now broadened out into a whole family of products under the Extranet User Manager brand. So long history there over the last dozen years or so. And if we go to the next slide, Michael, broad coverage, not just here in Canada, but across North America, Europe, and around the world. So Michael, let me pass it over to you.
Thanks, Peter. My name's Michael Hepples. I'm the Director of Operations with BlueShift. As Peter mentioned, already have my contact information on here, so anybody who needs to snag it can snag it from the deck afterwards. BlueShift we're a small Microsoft consultancy. We've been around for about 6 years, a little bit more than that. Have about 14 members on the team with a number of successful projects completed over the years. Our core focus, our core competency is built around SharePoint Online. We started as 4 SharePoint developers, SharePoint consultants in a kitchen, and have grown out and pivoted to support the full suite of Microsoft 365 products and services over the year. We hold 3 Microsoft Gold competencies: collaboration and content, project and portfolio management, as well as a silver in application development. Of course, I have to get my brag slide in as well. We've served well over 100 clients over the years. Some absolutely fantastic people to work with, and some household names mixed in there as well. Going to pass it over to Peter.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so if you have a chance, we'd love to get some feedback from you. You can either scan the QR code that we've got up on the screen here. So if you haven't done that before, just open the camera app on your phone. Don't actually take a picture of it, just kind of hover it over and it'll pick up that link and take you into a very simple Microsoft Forms poll. I think Logan's chatting the link out through the Q&A as well. And just side note, we do have the Q&A open. So if you've got questions as we're going through, by all means, feel free to ask your questions. We'll do our best to answer as we go through, and we'll have a look at the end and make sure we've caught everything from that perspective. So Michael, why don't we flip to the next slide, and why don't you give us a little background on the client? I understand we're not actually naming the client, but we've got a lot of context as to who they are that gives a sense of scale and project that you undertook here.
You betcha. So the client in this case was a national construction company. They're based locally here, Winnipeg, as well as in the GTA, and they operate across Canada, running large-scale, multi-year construction projects. They've got a fairly large user base, both internal and external. They've got 1,000 employees, more than 1,000 employees internally, as well as heavy external collaboration with over 5,000 external users, where they're bringing in subcontractors and contractors on a very regular basis. Originally, we've been supporting this client for a number of years, right back from when they started with SharePoint 2007 into 2010, and in this case, when we started off the project, all of their project sites were currently running in SharePoint 2013, and there was somewhere north of 2,000 sites.
Cool, thanks, Michael. So let's talk about the challenges then. So if we flip to the next slide here, I love the clock is ticking. We've actually done quite a number of SharePoint 2010 end of lives, which was supposed to be last October, got moved out to this April and has now gone by. But we're going to see the same thing happening on the 2013 side of things. It's really only got another 2 years left of life there. And that's obviously a challenge from a technology refresh point of view, keeping up to date from that perspective. So chat a bit about that side of things.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing on our end, Peter. We're having a lot of migration work over the last year. Part of it being COVID and everybody needing to work from wherever they happen to be, as well as that. Yeah, the clock is ticking with the end of life on SharePoint 2013. So. As a lot of organizations are doing, they did an analysis to understand whether there was a value in keeping an on-premises SharePoint presence. We participated in that and helped them through that. They currently have the SharePoint 2013. There was no reason, there was no block to keeping them from going to SharePoint Online. Just to kind of kick that can down the road with an on-prem wasn't going to provide them with the value that they needed. They had already implemented Microsoft 365. They had moved their identity and access management into Microsoft 365. They were already using Exchange Online for email, as many organizations start with. And this was the next logical step for them, was to take this significant SharePoint investment and move it into SharePoint Online.
I guess that's a common pattern we see as well, is that the client's already made the investment in Microsoft 365. They're paying for the whole suite, and they're still running SharePoint servers on premise. It just makes no sense. I mean, if there's something that really sticks, we've got a client or two that are still on InfoPath. Much as I hate that tool, it's still around. And they've done some back end customizations that just won't go to online. So you got to look for gotchas like that. But I guess in this particular case, it was really around project and document collaboration. I'm assuming there wasn't a lot of big gotchas in terms of moving it to 365.
No, not really. Not from a SharePoint standpoint. There were a few gotchas in there with particular files and the way that they were being used. But by and large, it was pretty much a change management exercise in order to help map that over to new and improved functionality in Microsoft 365.
I guess you just twigged me on something we see a fair bit in the construction, engineering, architectural spaces. They do a lot of CAD work and things like AutoCAD, despite pronouncements from Microsoft about how Autodesk and Microsoft are doing awesome things together, they really don't play well together still, even today in 2021. I mean, tell me about those. Were there challenges on that side, and how did you deal with that?
We did. As with any of these projects, it wasn't something that featured highly at the beginning, but once the rubber hit the road and we were looking at a real launch date late in the project, we ended up with an issue coming up of, hey, we have all of these files. Naturally, because they're not the application isn't necessarily built to support kind of cloud native storage. That user process ends up being, hey, I've gone and I've opened up my document, I've opened up my drawing file or my CAD file that I've stored in SharePoint, and it's been downloaded. Now I have a local copy and I have to re-upload it. And that's obviously not an optimal situation. We ended up getting around that using OneDrive for Business Sync and having them sync those files so that they were able to access them as a local file within their drive. It did come up, but we managed to find a workaround fairly quickly. And they were able to continue on. Cool. Probably a larger impact was macro-enabled Excel files, which do not like to sync if you don't have custom scripts enabled on the site. So that was a fun one to deal with as well.
Right. Yeah, always those little gotchas you got to think about as you're going through these processes. As we talk more about the project templates and the external user management, I guess there was a heavy IT focus on their existing processes that you were looking to address.
Exactly. So traditionally, as with many organizations, IT was kind of the central funnel point for a lot of what was happening in SharePoint. Needing a new project site required. I went and I created I as a user went and created a ticket with IT to say, hey, I need a new project. which of course evolved over time. We had a number of different, since they've been using it since 2007, they had a number of different templates that were created where if it was done within this period of time, they'd had a site with 3 subsites. If it was done in this period of time, it had a single subsite. If it was done here, it may have up to 8 subsites. So there was not a lot of consistency between it. It was almost like digging through layers to figure out when a site was created based on what template was used. And again, it was I had to send a ticket into IT, very, very similar to the way that they had the external user management. You had to do that IT ticket to say, I need to be able to share this externally. I need to be able to collaborate externally. And not having self-service password reset. So that had to be done at an IT level, et cetera.
Right. And, at the end of the day, IT really doesn't want to be the gatekeeper on this kind of stuff, and often isn't very responsive as a result for that. So, the more you can make it self-service, the better from that point of view.
Yeah,
so,
it's a significant bottleneck.
So why don't we switch gears? Let's talk about the overall project itself from a lifecycle perspective. When did it start? How did it run?
Sure. Overall, it ended up being about a 17-month-long project from, date of paper being signed until, the official sign off from the client saying, hey, we're launched, we're good, and we don't require anything further.
Cool.
Yeah, so it was a fairly significant length of project. Actual migration kicked off roughly July of last year, and July, and ran through for a solid 8 months. To get all those sites integrated.
To give some context there, I mean, you mentioned 2,000 plus sites. I think you told me previously it was somewhere north of 20 terabytes of content. I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of content to move across into SharePoint Online.
No, not at all. It was fairly significant. Again, probably good to move on to the next slide here, but maybe we'll just stick with the project lifecycle for the time being. Yeah, not an insignificant number of sites or volume of content to move. A lot of it was they were very document heavy, as most construction companies are. So not a lot of list items, very much heavy onto document libraries and migration of documents to get this done.
Yeah, I guess the thing for people to take away from this is, it's not an over the weekend migration kind of thing, unless you're a very small organization. I mean, there is a fixed size pipe into SharePoint Online. You can expand that. I mean, in your case, I think you just used a single copy of ShareGate to push through. We've gone as high as 15 running concurrently just to try and pump more data through there. But at the end of the day, it's okay, this many gig per hour is what you can push through, and do the math, and it's going to take a significant amount of time. And you basically ran pretty much around the clock, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, we basically had to with when migration was generally kicking off, and as you're well aware, last year with COVID and the increased usage of Microsoft 365, Microsoft put in much more aggressive throttling thresholds during business hours. So generally speaking, Monday to Friday from 9 to 5, the throttling threshold was much faster. It was much more aggressive. So trying to do any significant migration work during the day, you ran the risk of locking yourself out entirely and slowing down your total migration velocity. So the vast majority of the actual migration of content was happening, evenings and weekends,
right,
in order to avoid that throttling.
Now, at the end of the day, I mean, you didn't tell the client, hey, just stop working for 8 months while we get this migration done. So they had to, keep running as a business as they're going through there. Tell us a bit how you managed that, because there must have been a transition period where some of the project sites were migrated and they're using SharePoint Online and some were on-premise still.
Yeah, generally speaking, we had a bit of a phased migration approach where, so as part of the project, one of the items that we did, and you'll see here on the timeline, is that we did create a custom provisioning app for creating templated project sites. So the project managers could go in and request a specific project site, enter in those critical details, and have it created per the standards that were established by the client. We launched that. So the cutover for that was approximately in November of last year, which really was a specific decision to say you are no longer going to submit an IT ticket in order to get a new project site. all net new projects will be done via this provisioning app. And
cool. So even though the migration project was still in flight, net new projects were actually already going on the new system, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's correct. When we made that decision in order to make sure that, because migration was a moving target, especially over that period of time, as new projects are being spun up, as new sites are being created, we had to constantly be going back and doing another inventory and reclassifying all of those sites so that they can be brought into the migration effort. So the initial step was, we're no longer creating any new ones. We have our set inventory that we can continue to migrate. Any net new are going to be done by the provisioning application, so that we didn't have so much of a moving target there. Right. And we're really able to focus on getting the rest of the project sites migrated.
Across. Yeah. So that beginning part, the roadmap ECM engagement, why don't we dive a little deeper into what that looked like?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we've been supporting this client for a number of years, again, all the way since SharePoint 2007. And so originally they had reached out to us to say, hey, we know we want to go to SharePoint Online. We've had some conversations. We know that there's no specific reason to stick with an on-prem, and that there's a lot of value to happen with Microsoft 365. We were engaged to generally run through a prototype, run through a pilot, not quite a pilot, but a prototype with a smaller group of users that were heavily invested in the business from a technical perspective as well as from an operational perspective, and help them really write the business case for why they should do it, and scoping out that larger migration project, identifying what the benefits were, what those gotchas or transformation points were going to need to be. External user management, of course, was a key item. Establishing that template, recognizing that there had been multiple templates over the years, recognizing the fact that in their current monolithic structure with a site collection and subsites, that was not going to necessarily be a very Teams first approach or Microsoft best practice flat hierarchy approach. And so understanding what that template needed to be in that newly transformed environment, and really providing that proof of concept for, we established a light enterprise content management with a light taxonomy, and proofing out some of those external access scenarios to really understand, having that binary of these sites are internal only, these sites are external only, and this is what that user experience is going to look like, both from an internal resource as well as from one of these external resources that we're bringing on. Naturally, everybody's got a great plan until they get punched in the face. So once we rolled out of the prototype phase and started actually implementing this with the business, we switched gears into a very highly iterative approach, really sitting down with the business and going, hey, so we have these guiding principles. We've said that this is what the template is going to be. These are what the document libraries are going to be on the site, and then really working through that with the business end users to understand how they were using the site in their own ways, and modifying and iterating on that template to make sure that we were meeting their needs and they weren't having to necessarily conform 100% to decisions made by people that don't do what they do. Cool.
Now, I mean, one of our challenges when we've had projects like this has been, can we keep it to one template or two or three templates? Because one size fits all often doesn't work for most organizations. They've got little tiny projects and they've got massive decades-long projects. Did you face some challenges there, and how did you address that?
So most of the time, I in this particular case, well, as a general rule, there is no one size fits all. I completely agree, and not once have I ever found a client that has a one size fits all approach to their project template. Generally speaking, what we did is design that template, design that provisioning process to be as flexible as possible, built around kind of a core kernel. So we, established those guiding principles to say there will be the following audiences, there will be the following groups that are going to be interacting with the site. We are going to do the following All documents are going to be stored in that project site. All project information is going to go in that project site. And this is the general rules of engagement for a project. This is what qualifies as a project. So really defining that out with the client. So they had that core kernel that was common to all projects, and then giving them the ability through the provisioning tool, through the fact that the provisioning tool was creating these sites off of a core template site collection that could be iterated on and updated on a regular basis as the needs evolve, as well as just end user training of, I understand you don't like it the way it is. Here's how you can make the modifications that you're allowed to make in order to make it fit better what you're doing on your specific project.
Cool. Well, why don't we've touched on the migration, but why don't we dive a little deeper into the actual process of taking that, you've got it here, 20 terabytes of content, that's a big number, and moving it across into SharePoint Online.
Yeah, so again, not not an insignificant amount of data to be moved, and not an insignificant amount of impact. 2,078 sites was our final total. Over 20 terabytes of content was migrated throughout the course of the project. Again, really started with, we need to know what we don't know. Doing a classification and an inventory exercise, as I already mentioned, that was something that happened consistently throughout the project, where we had to, because projects were either being created or they were moving through their natural life cycle between, at the beginning of the project, we've inventoried all of these sites, and these sites are on an active migration path, meaning that they are still required for external users. They're still being actively collaborated on and actively worked on, versus an archive site which may have closed X number of years or X number of months in the past, and is being kept around for record keeping purposes, for historical reference. So we provided that initial inventory and that worked through that initial classification exercise. As I already mentioned, we did implement a light ECM, so that included, establishing that taxonomy and applying that taxonomy to those different sites, and then doing that on an ongoing rotating basis throughout the course of the migration to make sure that A, all sites were captured, and B, that when they were being migrated, they were being migrated according to the correct path. They were being handled appropriately.
Very good.
Yeah.
So you've got a point there about flattening the information architecture. I mean, this is something we've seen a ton, is that, in the past, we were guilty of this ourselves. You'd create a deep sub-site structure under one big site collection in SharePoint on-premises. And you didn't have to do it that way. In fact, I can still hear Dan Holm, who's now with Microsoft. He used to be an MVP in the past, just ranting about people doing that 10 years ago. And I thought, what's the big deal? And his vision was spot on, that, okay, every site really should be a site collection. It should stand on its own. And as we move into teams, which I understand wasn't really a part at the beginning of this project, but you just can't ignore that these days, is that every team has a team site and it's its own site collection, so you really need that flattened architecture. So how tough was that to say, hey, we've got a completely different IA in SharePoint, and we want to turn it into something modern?
Functionally, technically, very simple to do. However, the real challenge was introducing the concept to the business to understand, to help them understand why. First of all, why do we need to do this? What value is there? What benefit are they going to realize? And what that experience was going to look like, and taking some consideration to how they are currently leveraging that, and how they're currently navigating around in that 2013 on-premise environment, and how that was going to look, what that architecture was going to look like, and what that navigation flow was going to look like from an end user perspective once it had been flattened out.
Right. Now, you use ShareGate. I'm a big ShareGate fan. We use it on a ton of our projects. I mean, there is the Microsoft tooling that's freely available from Microsoft. It's getting better.
Yep.
We still tend to default to ShareGate as our first choice. I mean, did you look at the Microsoft tooling, and what was your decision on ShareGate?
We did look at the Microsoft tooling, because that's due diligence, always making sure that we're comparing. At the end of the day, ShareGate, I'm a huge fan of ShareGate. I've been a ShareGate fanboy for a number of years, and I always go stop and see them anytime I'm up at a Microsoft conference. It really is my go-to tool, and when it comes to being able to handle a migration of this size, I'm sure we probably could have got through it with the SharePoint migration tool free from Microsoft, but especially given at that point in time, it was still
less mature. Yeah,
it was much less mature at that point. And ShareGate being just a ready to go off the shelf, very mature tool, it was a bit of a no-brainer at that point.
Yeah, it's easy and it works. I mean, that sells it right there.
Yeah.
Cool.
And the value when it comes to, you know, that amount of sites and that amount of data, there's definite value proposition there from even just a reporting that constant need to inventory and classify.
Yeah,
right?
Which of the several million documents didn't migrate properly, and how do I go figure that out? You just want to have confidence in the tool. Absolutely. Exactly. So switching gears, there was a lot of external users as part of this. So as a construction contracting, they've got lots of subs, clients, people need to come in on these projects. That was obviously a big part of it. And they had a pretty old school forms-based authentication, managed by IT, awkward process that, they obviously wanted to improve on that. So let's talk more about how do you get those 5,000 people in as guests and working with Microsoft 365.
Yeah, so I worked pretty heavily with EUM and with Logan. We had a wonderful little virtual brainstorming session to really walk through the entire process there to make sure that because project sites still needed to have those external users. So I've got an external user here in SharePoint 2013, and that needs to be seamless. It needs to be that if we flip that switch between today and tomorrow, that external user we don't want to have to teach this guy how to get to where he needs to be. We use the URL rewrites in IIS to automatically redirect as we launched sites. And so what we really wanted to do is provide that seamless, I clicked this link that worked for me yesterday, and now I'm in SharePoint Online, and it really doesn't matter, and it's a seamless experience for me. So a key part of that was taking all of these users from the on-premise FBA solution and bringing them into SharePoint Online and specifically Azure Active Directory, and that in EUM, of course, was a key part of that. So what we ended up doing is we did a bulk import, so all the groups, all the permissions, all those roles, doing a bulk import into EUM once it was set up. We set them up as guest users. We set them as active and made sure that we didn't send them any emails because we didn't want to jump the gun and cause a whole bunch of confusion from a communication standpoint. And then that way, what we were able to do is between having those users already active and valid in Azure Active Directory, we were able to create a ShareGate mapping file so that as we were migrating those users over, we were able to have full fidelity. So if the user had created or modified a document on-prem, they were also showing as creating or modifying that document in Azure Active Directory, and those permissions and that time, the time and author stamps were all maintained with full fidelity.
Nice. So you've got full audit and version history maintained through that process.
Exactly.
Well done. So the external users, even though they didn't know it, they actually got migrated first. And then the content came, and then once it was all ready, okay, let them know that, hey, here's the new home. And I like the idea of using the redirects on the old SharePoint site. So if they still log in there expecting to go find their stuff, boom, it just fires them across over into SharePoint Online. I mean, they'd have to have a different set of credentials. Obviously, one of the challenges with bringing existing users out of an old school type of authentication system is you can't bring their credentials with them, nor do you want to. You kind of leave all those passwords behind and say, okay, we're setting up new accounts for them.
Yeah.
And I think a little later in the deck, we're going to talk about that user onboarding experience in a 365 and how it depends on whether they use 365 themselves as external users or whether they're just using a Microsoft account or different methods in there. Cool.
Exactly.
Okay. Exactly. So why don't we take what we've gone through here and say, okay, the focus was to make life better, for the most part for the PM themselves that's running their projects. Obviously, everybody involved in the project, you want them to benefit as well. But let's talk about the day in the life of that construction PM. What does that look like? If I'm starting net new and I'm going to, spin up my new project, where do I start and what does that look like?
Yeah, so it was a fairly significant change for project managers. specifically because they were, they were empowered through this migration and through the new tools and functionality they had between SharePoint Online and EUM. They were really empowered to start and move their projects forward in a way that they just didn't have before. So they were able to fill in a very simple form, guided form, through the provisioning solution where they could enter in all their critical project details, like whether a team was required for this project, if they needed to use Microsoft Teams, if they needed to have external access to this site at that point in time, all of that information, and have that automatically create a listing in the site directory for navigation, create a SharePoint project site that was based on the template, all that appropriate structure and functionality already included and ready to go. That provisioning also would, send a quick note off to IT, would open an IT ticket in the system to say, we need some groups created for external access if that had been done. So rather than entering in a bunch of tickets and sending off a bunch of emails and going back and forth, project manager is simply able to enter in their information and move forward and have everything created for them. They were that template, that created site would also include the EUM web part. That was a key bit of functionality that we included with this. And so they were able to manage that access very quickly and easily by adding and removing users for the web part, sending a private registration link, generating that link and sending it off to somebody so that they were able to go through that onboarding process themselves.
So I guess the key there, I mean, they may not even know who they're collaborating with. You can send that link to one person and they can share it with a bunch of friends, and that's okay because there's approvals around that, and you can really figure out who your external users actually are, because that's one of the challenges, is you don't even know who that audience is sometimes.
Yeah, and then because they were integrated directly into that approval process, they really, because IT,
they own it. Yeah. At the end of the day.
IT's a level or two removed from that project, so they're not necessarily going to know whether Bob Smith at XYZ company should even have access. So the project managers really had that granular level of access to say, here's a link, you can share it out, and I'm going to be the gatekeeper that's going to allow you in or not, which helped immensely. One of the things that did evolve quite heavily throughout the project is the way that the documents were stored within a project. Originally, the thought was to have multiple document libraries because that sounded really good from a separation of content perspective. Ultimately, from a day-to-day reality, what ended up evolving is a single directory that had some very semantically labeled folders, so I did not have to think as a project manager, if I put a document in here, this is who has access to it. It's very clearly labeled that these are contractor documents, these are client documents, these are internal documents, to make it sure that, again, just to make it as seamless as possible, less thought, less steps, very quickly and easily able to store and see exactly who has access to what, and that the external parties are able to collaborate with me as a construction project manager securely and freely, because they only have access to what they should have access to, and I don't have to worry about them seeing somebody else's information.
Yeah, and I like the idea of keeping that at the folder level to say, hey, we're not asking the PM to mess with SharePoint permissions, because inevitably that gets broken and messed up. Just to say, we've set the template up, it's all ready for you to use. Just put things in the right place, and if you drop it in here, this person sees it, and if you put it in here, different person sees it. It becomes very easy for them to get their head around that.
Exactly, and it's already created as part of the provisioning, so there's absolutely nothing for the project manager to do other than start work. Yeah, and that really does establish, another favorite phrase of mine, single source of truth. Yes. Right? For anything that's related to the project from a collaboration standpoint, the client does have other line of business applications that are working from like an accounting and a management standpoint. But really, when it comes to me as a project manager collaborating and working through the project, I have a single source of truth for everything that's going on, whether it's internal or external.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that. I mean, I hate email attachments, and as soon as you do that, you have an infinite number of sources of the truth, and none of them are actually right. So, getting everybody to work against one spot is hugely beneficial, particularly when you get large groups of people collaborating together.
Exactly.
The last point on the OneDrive sync. So I kind of wish that Microsoft didn't call it OneDrive sync, because people think it's just for syncing my OneDrive. It's not. It'll sync anything in SharePoint, and hugely powerful. And a lot of people don't realize that, hey, I can access my SharePoint content through Windows Explorer like I'm used to off the file share. But more importantly, I can access it offline. So I imagine these PMs, don't live in an office. They're out on site, and who knows whether they got internet connectivity or not. Tell us a bit about how that addressed that for them.
Well, yeah. So previously with SharePoint 2013, obviously they needed VPN access. They needed to sit down and actually connect to VPN and go through VPN in order to access their files. And what they were also doing is they were using mapped drives to specific SharePoint document libraries. And so that obviously, if I didn't have a live internet connection, a live data connection, those weren't going to work. And so there was times where they were working offline and trying to store files, and that just wasn't. There was an extra step
download and work locally, and then upload.
Step that need to happen later. So introducing OneDrive Sync, and I completely agree with you that with the way that that's worded it does tend to be misleading. I have that conversation on a regular basis of what's the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint files are in OneDrive and all that kind of fun stuff, but. Introducing OneDrive for Business, when introducing that OneDrive sync of SharePoint files was really a bit of a game changer for them, because not only did they still have their files available to them in Windows Explorer, but the ability to, one with the files on demand feature, so that they weren't, loading up their hard drive with a whole bunch of files, but having that offline access, being able to keep a local copy that was always synced, so that when they were, out on a construction site with poor or no reception, or traveling on the road, that they still had access, that they can continue to work on those files, and then the next time they connected to data, they would have that update and still have all those wonderful goodies that are available with a file being stored in SharePoint, with versioning and permission access, and the ability to quickly and easily share a file with a link, instead of, as you already mentioned, going and attaching that file to an email and generating an infinite number of iterations of that as people start opening it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we did a few dry runs of this. In hindsight, I'm thinking our next slide we probably should have done earlier, but let's touch on it. It's really about the business case for the project itself. So let's maybe just briefly recap. We've touched on a lot of these points.
Yeah. So yeah, generally speaking, one of the key things for them, as I mentioned already, was they had multiple templates that have been established over the years. So there were really two guiding principles to that. One, we want a template, and we want it to be as simple as possible to apply that template and not have to worry about, teaching project managers or anybody else a whole bunch of information about how to set up a site and update that site and modify and administer that site. We just wanted to be kind of set it and forget it for them. And we also needed to make sure that it was something that could be updated as the needs of the business changed. So we wanted to make sure that was built in there. We implemented that provisioning solution to make sure that, again, it was as simple as possible for a new site to be created, to be requested, obviously with a bit of approval built in there, making sure that it was as seamless as possible for internal and external users through baking EUM directly into that template. Making sure that we had a single template that had that core kernel of functionality that was consistent across all projects, that could then be adjusted and could be augmented for additional project needs, or the evolving needs of projects at the client.
Right.
Yeah, and predefining out the different components of that template.
So we've talked a lot about templating. So why don't you take us through the options, and this is a bit of a, today, not 2 years ago when you were starting the project state, but nevertheless.
That's always the fun with with Microsoft 365 and just the tools that
things change all the time. Yeah,
it constantly evolves. So at the time that we were doing this, we the best option, the best solution at the time was to create a Power App, and I can go into that a little bit later as far as what that looked like. But we implemented a Power App solution. Obviously, there's other open source solutions. EUM, you have your own open source solution for provisioning. And then there's also tools like Orchestrate, which we're both partners of, which really helps with what it comes down to is that democratizing, set it and forget it. Here are my rules around the templating. Here's the features and the functionality that I either want baked in or I want to make available as options to my users when they're creating things. I can set that from a care and control standpoint, and my end users can leverage those features and functionality and some of those wonderful automated goodies. I mean,
it really comes down to governance at the end of the day, and
exactly.
Michael, who's not Michael yourself, Michael Basaric from Orchestrate has done a really good job of is thinking about the full life cycle there. So Orchestrate has this concept of workspaces that you can define that make up a team and a team site and planner and OneNote and a bunch of different components there that you can configure. But it's not just about creating them; it's the end of life as well, and it's something that we haven't addressed on our open source side. And I don't think you've taken into consideration on the Power App side, which is when a project's done, what do you do with it? If there was a team associated with that, and Teams wasn't part of this one, but that's the new world that we all live in. How do we archive all those conversations and kind of tuck it away so that our environment doesn't get cluttered with redundant information and such from there? So
yeah,
ours going there.
Yeah, our solution is as many of them are, yours, mine, pretty much everybody's, it focuses very much on the SharePoint end of things from an archival perspective. So there is some lifecycle management that's built into it, but it is very SharePoint centric, as opposed to Orchestrate, which I know is building out a significant amount of that to really look at that holistically and say, hey, we've got a team, we've got a OneNote notebook, we've got a planner. And all of this is valuable, not just the stuff that's sitting in the SharePoint site. Absolutely.
Yeah. So give us a look at your Power App, though. I'm curious what you've got there.
Yeah. So this is obviously a screenshot of our demo. It's been heavily sanitized to protect the innocent, and so generally speaking, again, it provides a very guided experience for a project manager to move into and move through creating a new request when they needed to when they need a new project. It does include a review by IT and the ability to see along that process where it currently is and when the request is completed. Once that request has been completed, this can also be used as a reference to gain specific information on that item from an architectural standpoint. This reads and writes to a SharePoint list. So we have a master site directory that's created that becomes that single source of truth, that navigation, that searchable directory for all projects. A custom UI through Power Apps. We used a Canvas-driven app for this. We have a couple of Power Automate flows. One that happens through this that triggers the new request approval and moves through that process, as well as triggering an Azure Runbook, which does all the heavy lifting. It's executing some P&P PowerShell, pulling that base template over in real time, and setting up all the various values based on what that project manager originally entered prior to the approval happening.
So architecturally, actually very similar to our own open source provisioning, where same concept of a master SharePoint list that drives the whole thing. We decided to do a SharePoint framework web part as the front end tool, but I mean that's just a UI decision as to how that's built. And then same thing, we've got some workflows that call to Azure Automation and Runbooks to do all the heavy lifting. So yeah, good pattern there.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's switch gears to the external sharing side of things. So yeah, forms-based authentication is not an option at all in 365, and everything is using the guest user concept, which are actually users in your Azure AD, but they're not full members of your tenant. They're external to your organization. And I guess there's some licensing things people should be aware of around those guest users, that you don't need to license those users either for Azure AD or for SharePoint. You've got literally unlimited numbers of those that you can do. Just don't get excited and buy a one user subscription for your company and make all your other employees guests, because that is clear violation of the Microsoft licensing terms. They have to be external to your organization. But so it's obviously doing the current forms-based authentication, that was a non-starter. That wasn't going to happen. So yes, you could use the out-of-the-box features like we have on the screenshot there, where I share links and share things out from there. Kind of comes back to my earlier point that if you let the PMs manage permissions and do all this ad hoc themselves, it's going to become a dog's breakfast. Like, it's going to be all over the map. So you need some sort of structured way around that, which is really where Azure Active Directory B2B comes in and saying, okay, we can help you manage that. We can use groups. We can make it role-based. We can do all the good things from an identity access management point of view. The challenge there, I guess, is how do you manage those Azure AD users? You don't want IT. If we come back to the business case, they don't want to be a gatekeeper in any of this. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the external user experience. What is this like for somebody outside of the client organization that wants to come in and interact? And I kind of alluded to this earlier, that there's going to be different experiences depending on how those people interact with Microsoft. And the ideal is if that person that you've invited in uses Microsoft 365 themselves, they already have their own Azure AD credentials. And they're going to use those same credentials. In fact, if they're already signed into their own company's portal or Office 365 in any way in the browser, and they hit the link to come into this extranet portal, they're not even going to see a sign-in. It's just going to provide single sign-in. So that's a really smooth path through. And even if they're not 365, if they have a personal Microsoft account, it'll work the same way from that point of view. And where it differs is if they don't have Azure AD in their organization. And I know this particular client made a slightly different decision, and this was earlier days. This is all changing, where users, if they don't have Azure AD credentials themselves, are actually prompted through a wizard to set those up and set up a password and a password retrieval process. And honestly, we found that a little onerous and overwhelming. We got a lot of drop off where people just give up on that process and say, forget it, it's not worth the effort to come in here. And Microsoft, I guess about 18 months ago, brought out this option of a one-time passcode. Basically says, hey, if you don't already have an Azure AD credential, we're not going to force you to make one. We're just going to send you a passcode each time you go to log in and use that to log in. It's valid for a short period of time, and it's really low friction. It's also nice because it validates that person actually owns the email address. So if they've left their organization, in the first scenario, they're not going to have access to their Microsoft 365, which means they're not going to have access to your extranet either. But in the second scenario, they don't have access to their email because they've left that org, then they're locked out of your site as well, which is honestly, a keep awake scenario for a lot of chief security officers is how do we make sure that people that we've given access to our stuff still work for those organizations and should still be able to come in. So having that validation is in there is a good part of it. Yeah. Now they were going to force everybody to move to the one-time passcode approach as of this March. I think they pushed that back to the fall. So your client's got a little breathing room there. But if they thought about making that switch, have they had grief with people who don't have Azure AD credentials setting them up?
Not so far. Not that they've really brought up. I know the one-time passcode has been it's been a functionality, it's been a feature of functionality that's come up in a few different conversations. They're aware that the clock is ticking. They're aware that this is going to become a thing. That's not not going to be a choice at some point. But generally speaking, I think they've had bigger fish to fry, and they're starting to look at it a little closer now.
Yeah, and then the Google Facebook, I mean, that probably doesn't make sense for this scenario here, because the caveat with the Google one is people think, well, if my partner is on Google Business, then they'll be able to use their Google credentials. Well, unfortunately, it's not that rich. If they've registered their email domain as a vanity with Google, they're no longer a Gmail user from Microsoft's point of view, and they can't come in this way. It's really just personal Gmail and personal Facebook, which you probably, in this scenario, don't want coming into your portal.
No, and arguably, the hierarchy whenever talking about external access with a client, as far as bringing people on, the hierarchy always starts with they are using Microsoft 365. That's the first question of is your organization already using Microsoft 365? Because then, hey, it's quick, it's simple. You'll just send them an invite. They'll be able to redeem it. They'll be able to move through, and collaboration is quick and simple. And that organization, the point that you made about the no Azure AD account and the one-time passcode, it also validates that, look, if Bob is no longer at that organization, Bob no longer has access to his organizational account, I don't have to worry because that's already owned and that's already done as part of their onboarding process. I don't have to do a similar onboarding process on my side.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's switch gears to the PM side. Their experience in terms of basically inviting and managing the people that they're going to be working with. So Extranet User Manager, I mean, one of our big value propositions is delegation of administration. And you can do this out of the box. There's a role in Azure AD called the guest inviter role, and you can assign that to a PM. But to tell a PM, okay, go into the Azure portal, which is a super IT pro techie kind of experience to invite your users in, they're not going to be too keen on that. So I mean, our big thing is just like ShareGate, how do we make this simple? We've got a simple web part that I can just add users in. I can get a private registration link and share it out. I can go through approvals. So talk about that. I mean, we have a whole EUM admin console, but really, in this client's case, they pretty much live in the web part, don't they?
Yeah, and I think the key statement is they live in the site. They already live in the SharePoint Online site. So rather than saying, okay, Mr. Project Manager, here's your SharePoint site where you can do all this collaboration and have all of your single source of truth through your documents. But by the way, you need to go to this other spot in order to work with users, which are a key portion of this project.
Right.
You don't have to go to a different spot. You don't have to learn another set of tools. It's a web part. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's very streamlined for them to say, I need to add a user. They don't have to remember to go to Azure Active Directory, which I'm sure would make a lot of people in the IT department cringe at the idea of having a normal
business user. Yeah.
With read-write access in Azure Active Directory. And you don't have to, the admin console for EUM. That's how I tend to use EUM when because we use it internally, obviously. I tend to use the admin console. I don't mind bouncing around because I bounce around all day, but really you don't want to be asking a project manager to go and learn multiple things and go to different multiple spots. This right here with having that web part in there, it provides it in context. Here is where I am. I don't have to search. I don't have to know about what's going on. I am on the Acme project and I'm able to add somebody to the Acme project contextually right where I'm already doing the work and likely right where that collaboration request is coming from.
Right. Cool. So why don't we dive deeper into that process? So the next slide talks about invitation only versus private registration. So let's explore those two themes a little bit more. I mean, the invitation only, the PM knows who they want to collaborate with, whereas the private registration is more someone else who knows, and how do you sort of delegate that on? So if we flip to the next slide on the invitation only, I mean, this one's fairly self-evident. I mean, either I'm going to add individual users in through the plus on the invitation. So you just click through there. I think Logan's got some animations on there on you. Yeah. So I mean, I can do individual one-of invitations through email to let them know they can come into the site, or I can come down into the admin console. If we keep clicking through there and basically import in an Excel and have that go to bulk users, and that latter is really how you address those. Once you got everything set up and you're ready to invite in the 5,000 existing users, I'm assuming you use that bottom process of just pulling in a big Excel dump.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Exactly.
And then if we flip gears to the private registration, I mean, the idea here is that, I give somebody a link and they can spread that link out to whoever they want. They can then ask to join that group. And if they're not set up already, they can go through a registration process and basically create the guest account themselves. Now, they don't have any permissions at that point. They can't do anything with that account until it's been approved. So, an approval email would go back to the PM to say, hey, somebody's just asked to join this project site. Do you know them? And to your point, if that approval went to IT, they'd have no clue whether that person was supposed to be in that site or not, because they're not connected to that project. It's the PM that needs to make that decision. So we want to delegate that decision down to the PM.
Yeah, and being able to set that on a group by group basis, on a project basis, really made that much simpler and that much more seamless for the project managers when it came to that entire process between inviting and approving and beginning collaboration.
Right. Cool. So why don't we recap? Let's take it back to the PM and talk about the quick wins for them. So I mean, nobody likes to log into VPN and ensure that they have a live internet connection that's solid and stable off their cell phone on some construction site. So that must have been a big win for them. You know, and you know, kind of the carry on to that is, hey, I can work from anywhere, anytime. I could be on a plane. Not that that happens these days very much, but you know, hopefully those days will return again. Yeah, and you and I are on the same page. The single version of the truth, super important. You know, and the last point, just you know, the delegation, the saying, okay, PM, you know best, so let's let you make the decisions and manage these things. Don't be opening tickets with IT. You know, just you know, make sure that you can do what you need to do in a well-governed approach. So I love the solution that you've got here. It's come together really nicely.
Yeah, and it was really, like you said, the one we didn't explicitly put on here is it's that empowerment of the project manager right through the entire life cycle of the project, from creating that project, managing those external users, and doing that collaboration right through to the project completion.
Absolutely. So we got a couple of wrap-up points just before we close up. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Tick tock. Yes, the clock is ticking. And even if you were to say, well, let's upgrade to 2019, we've actually done a couple of those projects recently, and you know, there's very few reasons left to stay on premises. I mean, yes, I mentioned the InfoPath one. We've got a client in the police forces that has protected C assets, which the federal government hasn't certified for use in the cloud. They have done it for protected A and B. You know, so there's things like that that are still barriers to the cloud, but they're actually pretty few and far between. And for most organizations, there really aren't any insurmountable barriers to moving to the cloud. I mean, we used to get the argument quite often that, you know, we like to own and manage our data. We feel it's more secure that way. I call BS on that. I mean, there's no way a private organization, for the most part, does a good job with security as Microsoft does in the cloud. So there's, you know, that argument's out the window. I like the approach that you took of saying, hey, let's get a prototype going, let's get some business feedback, let's be iterative. You know, we're a big agile development fan in terms of how we engage with our clients. So I like to see that approach. I'm kind of chuckling on the house cleaning line there, though. It's funny, but it's also a little daunting for a lot of folks as well. You know, if you've got 20 terabytes of data that's in a dog's breakfast of, you know, 20 folders deep in 2,000 different subsites, you know, that's a big challenge. So you got to kind of make that into bite-sized chunks to say, okay, you know, the inventory that you did was really important there to say, hey, how do we help you make these decisions? You know, if this site hasn't been looked at in 10 years, it's a good chance maybe we should archive it. Like let's make those macro level decisions before we get down in the weeds too much. Yeah, the teams first, we didn't really talk about. So Teams was not really a part of this project at the outset, correct?
That's correct.
Now where is Teams in the organization today?
Teams is still on a very scoped rollout, not widely used, but again, it is something that we did heavily consider and was a key factor in that decision to flatten out. In that decision with the provisioning tool is, hey, you may not be using it right now, but you might, and if you do, we want to make sure that you're not. We want to make sure you're ready, and that's just it's a decision that needs to be made. There's not a technical debt there that's been incurred through however long it's taking you to get there.
We've had that conversation with a lot of clients to say, you know what, even if you're not ready for full on, you know, teams and channel conversations and everything else, if we don't flatten into a modern architecture, we're going to be talking to you about doing another cloud to cloud migration a year from now when you decide to go to Teams. So let's just deal with it now and make sure your information architecture supports that. Exactly. You know, and the consistency is a great thing to say, hey, you know, not just from the sites and the templates, but the permissions, the folders, who sees what. You know, the less decisions people need to make, the more it's laid out in front of them, the better. Like you said, the template is a starting point and people can diverge in different paths from there. But if you give everybody a blank slate, you're going to get an infinite number of different iterations of the templates. If you give people a strong starting point, yeah, they'll diverge, but there'll still be a very strong core consistency there.
Exactly.
And then the external sharing, you know, ad hoc versus structure. Does he get into thousands of external users? He really needs something to manage that. And, you know, back to the point about the PM, it's got to be self-service for them from that perspective.
Yeah.
So I know we're now T-1 minute, so we'll go real quick through these last two here. So anybody that's interested in learning more about this, contact information from myself, Michael, Logan's up on the deck here. As I mentioned, we're going to share the deck out, so you'll have all of our details. Feel free. I don't know, but Michael, I assume you're the same as me. You love having these kind of conversations and just blue sky about what can be done from that point of view.
It's my favorite kind.
Yep. And then a couple more webinars that are related to this coming up. I'm going to be doing one July 13th, specifically about the unstructured and structured, so kind of going deeper into the external sharing that we talked about in this one. And then there's not a lot of new features that came out at Ignite and Build this year from Microsoft around managing external identities. So things around self-registration and such that you can do out of the box. So comparing and contrasting that with what we do in the Extranet User Manager product and sort of some customer scenarios from that perspective. We didn't really get a chance to take a breath and look at questions. Logan, I don't know if you had any specific Q&As that you wanted to raise here. We can take those offline.
Peter, there were no pending questions.
Okay, perfect. Well, with that, I want to say thanks to everybody, and thanks, Michael, for joining us this afternoon. It was a very interesting project. Always love having these chats.
You betcha.
All right, thanks everybody. Bye now.